Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. And it's just it's such a great gathering of all the wisdom researchers all together in one room and, all this cross-fertilization. So what I'm going to do is a little bit different what the other speakers were doing, which were giving more of an overview of their research. I want to present from one particular study. And so my research has always looked at the relationship between wisdom and well-being, in particular in old age. And you find that they are positively correlated. But what are actually the predictors of wisdom and well-being in old age? Are they the same or are they different? So thinking about from a theoretical framework, Erikson's model of psychosocial growth has 8 stages, and 4 of those 8 stages are located in childhood, and the next 2 stages are in adolescence. So we have 6 stages that are basically in psychosocial growth located early in life. Then there's a midlife stage, generativity versus stagnation, and old age stage, ego integrity versus despair, with the virtue that results is wisdom. So the seeds of wisdom, according to this, are planted really, really early in life. And then I'm also looking at 3 principles of the life course paradigm, that life course development takes place over the whole life course, not just in childhood, in adolescence, that there is something like human agency, aka free will. And I know there's a discussion, does free will really exist and so on. And we know, of course, that free will is constrained by historical, socioeconomic, social condition and so on. But if you think that there is something like free will. And then linked lives, that people are embedded in relationship to other people, and of course starting with our relationship to our caregivers early in life. Okay, so here's the question: what are early and midlife predictors of wisdom and subjective well-being in old age? And if you look at the theoretical model, I would suggest that resources and assets in childhood, like the socioeconomic resources of the parents, the quality of childhood, and childhood temperament have an effect on personality in early adulthood, which then affect resources and assets in midlife, and then finally affect wisdom in old age and subjective well-being. But if we consider that personality is relatively stable, as some people think, they should also have an effect on old age wisdom and well-being, and there could be some really less pronounced but long-term effects from early childhood and on midlife and old age. So I have defined wisdom as an integration of cognitive, reflective, and compassionate qualities based on research by Clayton and Biring from the 1980s or even earlier. And so if you look at the cognitive component, it's defined as an understanding of life and a desire to know the truth. Now, I developed this, Howard already mentioned earlier, I developed a scale, 3-dimensional wisdom scale, that measures those 3 dimensions. But you can also, particularly if you're interested in studying wisdom in already existing surveys, you could use existing personality questionnaires and then just pick items that measure those 3 dimensions. This is actually what I have done here. And then you just look at these dimensions that can capture this. So for example, for the cognitive dimension, items or ratings should assess the ability and willingness to understand a phenomenon thoroughly, knowledge of the positive, negative aspects of human nature, acknowledgement of life's ambiguity and uncertainty, and the ability to make important decisions despite life's unpredictability and uncertainty. And then the cognitive, to get to all this, so the really important part is the reflective dimension of wisdom, which is defined at looking at phenomena and events from different perspectives, but also the ability to overcome subjectivity and projections. And again, you can look for items for this. And by doing this, through the full reflective dimension, by looking at phenomena and event from different perspectives, This reduces ego-centeredness and helps one to understand the deeper truths about life and makes one more sympathetic and compassionate toward others, which leads to the compassionate dimension. All right, so to study this, I was looking at the longitudinal study of adult development. I'm basically looking at 60-year longitudinal data. It's, I think, now in the 75th year. It's still going on, data collection. This study started out in the 1940s with sophomores from Harvard when they did the initial data collection. And at that time, they had over 250 Harvard men. And in 2000, when the men were about 80 years of age, 98 participated. And this is the study, this is the number I'm basically looking at. So even so, many of the men were privileged, not all of them were. About half, actually, were on fellowships and had some parents that did not attend university. So not all were really high socioeconomic status. But of course, once they got to Harvard, 70% earned a graduate school degree. So it's a select group, admittedly. So here, data collection, initial data collection during the men's sophomore year at Harvard. At this time, they also went to the parents. So they did retrospective data about the childhood and the medical history. And then they conduct additional interviews when the men were approximately 25, 30, 50, 65, and 85 years old. And also follow-up questionnaires every 2 years and physical examinations every 5 years, starting at the age of 35. So as I said, I used this Gallup Wellspring of a positive life survey that the men got when they were around 80. And I picked items. To get the cognitive, reflective, and compassionate dimensions, and it worked out well. Those 3 dimensions correlate with each other, and they're measured on a 1 to 5 scale. And then I basically took the average of the 3 dimensions to create a composite wisdom scale. And at that time, they also had late life subjective well-being. They asked a well-being letter, then satisfaction with life, 1 item, and 5 items that assess general satisfaction and well-being. So I first want to look just at bivariate correlations, and then I do a path model with multiple imputation for some of the items that were missing at midlife and for the personality characteristics, and then correcting for the non-normal multivariate distribution. So if we just here looking at the results, so childhood predictors, global rater impression of a positive childhood. And they were particularly looking at those Erikson stages. So a positive childhood was 0.3 correlated with wisdom, at 80. Isn't this amazing? Childhood temperament didn't matter, but school and sports success mattered. In this, again, around 0.3, but not for late life well-being. What mattered for late life well-being was neuroticism extroversion. Neuroticism also mattered for late life wisdom, and here we go, openness to experience. And then at midlife, what mattered was there was a rating, an Erikson stage rating, if they had reached up to generativity at midlife. That mattered for late life wisdom, but also for well-being. Subjective health, almost significant, but not quite. Objective health, not at all. And then psychological health, yes, mattered for late life wisdom. But what I did, I actually tried to put this all together in a path model and looking at only including significant effects here. And this is what happened. This is the path to old age well-being. Social class of parents had a negative effect on extroversion. We can talk about why this is. I think it's a selection effect. But basically, extroversion and neuroticism predicted old age subjective well-being in young adulthood. And I should say that those, except for agreeableness, those personality characters for these particular men were actually quite stable. But then, for wisdom, it was a little bit more complicated. So this is the path, what I would call the psychosocial growth model. Greatest positive impression of childhood had a positive effect on adolescent school and sports success, which had a negative effect on neuroticism, which had negative effect on Erikson's stage model, but Erikson's stage model then had a positive effect on old age wisdom. So we have this path, psychosocial path, starting in raters in a positive childhood that led to old age wisdom. And there was a branch here from adolescent school and sports success, which also was directly affecting old age wisdom. Remember, this is over 60 years later. And another path over subjective health. Now, why subjective health? It's not objective health, it's subjective health. And my feeling is it's more like an absence of ill-being. You know, just not feeling well in your own body, or maybe also an over-concern with your own body, you know, like a kind of a self-centeredness. So this subjective health seems to capture, indeed, some kind of maturity. And then, but for those who didn't have the best of childhood, there is another pathway to old age wisdom, and that is openness to experience. You know? So there are two different pathways, basically. And here and I should mention that even so, after controlling for all of this, old age subjective well-being and wisdom were still correlated, but reduced from the bivariate correlation of 0.3 to 0.17. So just, if you look at the total effect, there are, as I said, for well-being in old age, only neuroticism and extroversion, but for late life wisdom, it's more complicated. So in conclusion, also wisdom and well-being in old age were related for the man. Long-term predictors differed. Personality traits in early adulthood predicted subjective well-being 60 years later. And then you have these two distinct pathways predicted old age wisdom, psychosocial growth throughout life, facilitated by supportive social environments in childhood and adolescence, which I think is this school and sports success, indicates a supportive social environment, positive early personality traits and midlife generativity, and also perceptions of greater subjective health. And then the second path, the motivation to grow through an openness to experience. So both a supportive social environment during the formative years and personality seems to promote growth in wisdom throughout life. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, very generous of you. I'll try to be quick if I can. This is very interesting, Monika. I'm just trying to think about two things. Number one, well, first of all, I mean, always have to be careful with such a complex path models if you have only 90 people. I think it's, you don't have enough power to really get reliable estimates there according to the SEM procedures. But that aside, that's just a little caveat that you probably know much better than I do.
Yes, you don't know. That's the thing. We just don't know if you have small sample sizes.
Yeah. My two comments about, one is, I was a little bit puzzled that, I mean, the juicy part of your wisdom scale and the model that you, based on Vivian Clayton's work, is the interaction, and or as you just described, the integration of this reflective, cognitive, and benevolent components. And I would wonder if you have such a rich data set, how this interaction plays out, and what is the relationship of these components with respect to well-being, with respect to different personality characteristics, and so on. So quite often, I see in your work that you sort of collapse it because you say, well, it's all kind of playing a role. But for me, that is not very satisfactory, because like, well, but it's about how they integrate it, that where the wisdom is. That's how you emphasize it theoretically. And I would love to talk more to you about that. Like, what do you think is the integration, and how does this integration play a role, for instance, in the SEM model, and in general, when you're looking at predictors of well-being? So that's sort of my question.
Yeah, and I looked at it, but I have to tell you, I don't actually remember which one. You're basically asking which of the components, right, is more strongly related to well-being and the other variables. Is this what you're saying in terms of wisdom?
As well as how they're related to each other over the lifespan, as well as
Well,
how
we
they're
don't
related to personality characteristics differentially.
Right. I mean, we only have this one measure of wisdom, right, at age 80, so we don't have a lifespan relationship. In terms of, the problem is that there are not a lot of items here per se to really, I'm not sure if I'm really completely trusted as a standalone, except maybe for the compassionate dimension, which has 10 items. But I looked at it individually, and I don't, quite frankly, I don't remember, you know, what if they correlated differentially with the different variables. I just don't remember. You know, you have to follow up with me on that.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think like when we talk about measurement, we're talking about what is
right.
making
However, I would argue that the three components are essential to define wisdom. It's not just a cognitive wisdom or reflective wisdom or compassionate wisdom. I would argue that actually the three components is what makes it wisdom. You know, because if you only have the cognitive component, it might be more intelligence. If you only have the compassionate component, well, it might be compassion, right? It's a combination of the three that makes it wisdom.
No, I get that. I'm just thinking that, you know, when you say it's a combination of the three, you need to look at the relationship that makes up that combination. Yeah. So it's not, you
I mean, they
just
are related. They are highly related to each other.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, yeah. The other little question is, you started this talk, and by looking at this gentleman, by talking about that this is very highly successful Harvard undergraduates, but at the end of the talk, I missed any contextualization of your findings. For instance, what struck me is that the extroversion may be very important for Harvard undergraduates for their career because of the trajectory that it takes you on when you are a Harvard undergraduate or a person of that very elite class. You have to be an extrovert in order to be successful, maybe satisfied with yourself, whatever makes up that satisfaction subjectively for you. For other groups, maybe extroversion is not important at all. You see what I'm saying? There is a degree of contextualization of this that we need to do automatically, because otherwise it's very hard to evaluate what these findings mean.
Well, it means something for this particular group, really.
Right, and that's what I want to emphasize.
And true, right? I mean, this is such an ideal data set to test this, because you have this indeed prospective longitudinal data that implicitly controls for gender and socioeconomic status and race. You know, so it's kind of, after controlling for that, this is what you get. You know, now what you are saying is might there be a moderation effect with gender, socioeconomic status, and race? And then, of course, I can test. It's basically controlling for these three variables.
I really enjoyed your talk. And I had a question about the scale you use to measure wisdom and its relationship to openness to experience specifically. So there was this finding that was in the post-traumatic growth literature about the relationship between optimism and post-traumatic growth. And then some researchers found out that the reason why that relationship existed was because these two scales shared common items, right? And I can imagine one of the challenges with measuring wisdom is that one's idea of a wise person could be someone who's open to experience, that could be one problem potentially with using openness to experience to predict wisdom, right? So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think there were overlapping items, or items that you think could?
Not in this case,
okay.
Because the personality characteristics were actually rated by psychiatrists and psychologists during the man's Harvard career, really the sophomore years, but I think might have been even more later or something. It's rated by that, and then one of George Whalen's colleagues took these ratings and made them comparable to Costa and McRae's neuroscales.
Right.
But these were not items, these are based on ratings. Whereas at the 80s, when the men were 80, these were indeed items that they self-assessed. So in this case, no, I don't think that there was any relationship.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.